Hey everybody, KC here. So you may remember that just before the holidays, we had a story about how Dollar General was opening a brand new distribution center in Blair, Nebraska, and basically sent a letter to its vendors saying that we're doing this, and but we're going to be charging a one-time new DC allowance to help offset the startup costs. 10% of the estimated cost of purchase is required to fully stock the new DC to support regular shipments to the assigned store base. I thought that was a little outrageous. Listen, none of this is new. As long as I've been writing about this industry, people have talked about slotting allowances and failure fees and all these fees that manufacturers get charged, that retailers make more money on the buy than they do on the sell. But this seemed, egregious to me. And then I was, getting all these emails from people saying, man, you have no idea. This is just the tip of the iceberg. So I wanted to know more about the iceberg. So I reached out to a friend. His name is David Friedler, and he is the president and managing partner of Simpactful, a really, really good consultancy. I don't talk to consultants much on Morning Newsbeat, but in this case, I really wanted to talk to David because, he was with Procter & Gamble for like a quarter century. He really knows this stuff. And Simpactful has a lot of really, really strong client relationships with a lot of manufacturers. And I thought he could give me some insight on what the situation is and if indeed it's worth resolving and if it even can be resolved. So we had a nice Zoom conversation. I hope you'll enjoy it. I hope you'll find it illuminating. I know I did. So again, here's my conversation with David Friedler of Simpactful. Well, David Friedler, welcome to Morning Newsbeat. Thanks for doing this.
Kevin, thank you. Happy to be here.
So the reason I wanted to talk to you was because we had this story that broke just before the holidays, and it was a letter from Dollar General to its vendors, basically saying, we're very excited to share with you, we're opening our 19th dry goods distribution center in Blair, Nebraska. And then he said, as in the past, as we grow, so do opportunities for you. Therefore, this doesn't sound like an opportunity to me, but that's, we will be charging a one-time new DC allowance to help offset the startup costs of the Blair DC. 10% of the estimated cost of purchases required to fully stock the new DC to support regular shipments to the assigned store base. And they're going to do it not by asking manufacturers to write a check, but rather just taking it off their invoices.
By deduction, yes.
In Godfather parlance, this is an offer they can't refuse. But the sense I got, and the reason I wanted to talk to you, because you've had so much experience in the packaged goods industry, was the email I got basically indicated, Kevin, this is just scratching the surface. I was outraged by this on the part of vendors. It just didn't seem cool. But apparently this is just the beginning. So tell me, how bad is this? Bad being my editorial observation on the subject, right?
Yes. Well, I'd lead by saying I've hard to believe been in this industry 33 years, even a little sooner than that, because I grew up around the business with my father in the wholesale retail business as well himself. And this has been to some degree going on back in, from that time and beyond. There's always been a cost of doing business. There's always been charges or requirements of cost between the vendor, the brand, and the retailer. There is no doubt, however, that we have seen since the pandemic, since the dramatic inflation in cost base for both brands and retailers, as well as increased cost of doing business for retailers, with added requirements for them on things like buy online, pick up in store, that we've seen a proliferation of costs being passed or attempted to be passed from the retailer back to the brand. In fact, in preparing for this discussion, I went through a list we've been keeping of the different types of required investments that a brand might see from a retailer. And there, in some cases, there could be 12 different types of charges, fines, or fees in different classifications that a brand might see from a retailer today.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mean to suggest it was a new thing. I can remember. I mean, I've been writing about the industry since, I don't know, 1984 1984. So I've been doing it a long time, right? And I can remember pretty early on, there was always discussion of slotting allowances and failure
Yep.
fees. That's what it came down to. And I can remember Glenn Trevik when he was running Anderson Consulting Smart Store in Chicago, when it was Anderson Consulting. Remember him doing the calculations at one point, and he tried to add up all of, basically the best he could come up with a number that was all of the fees and allowances that were being compiled by all these manufacturers, right? That had to be paid by manufacturers to retailers. And then he figured out what the retail profit was for basically every major retailer. And he said the amazing thing was they're almost the same number. That if manufacturers didn't pay those numbers, retailers wouldn't be profitable, which he said was unsustainable. Now, he said it 30 years ago, so clearly he was wrong on the sense that it was unsustainable, only because it's been sustained and actually has sort of grown. But the problem, it seems to me, is that retailers, and this continues to happen, is they're making money on the buy, not on the sell. And that corrupts the system, small c, not corrupt in a legal sense, but it corrupts the system in terms of, I think, in terms of how they make decisions about what they're going to carry.
Well, and it influences how a brand thinks about where they want to distribute their goods and who they want to sell to and who they invest in. And ultimately, this is just causing, friction, if you will, or cost in the distribution of goods from field to store. And ultimately, if good effort isn't brought to bringing these costs down, the consumer is going to pay for it. So this is ultimately, as we see it, it's impactful, about how do both entities maximize consumer value and make sure they're not, having to have cost any higher than they should be. And there's no doubt, I think, going forward, the rising investment requirements from a retailer could start to have an impact, if not already, on retail pricing.
Yeah, I mean, this is all sort of what led to ECR all those years ago. Right? A recognition. I mean, at the time, it was a recognition that Walmart was not charging all these fees. We can come back to that in a second because that's changed. But Walmart wasn't charging these fees, so the industry came up with efficient consumer response to figure out how to streamline the system. The problem is I've always thought they forgot about the consumer in that, because these fees all still exist. And as you just said, and they weren't good for consumers 30 years ago. I can't imagine they're not good for consumers today.
Yeah, I think also going back to your story, what the gentleman from Anderson Consulting back there said, and that it wasn't sustainable. I think to some degree he was right, because some of the retailers that got overly focused on just making their money on the buy, as you said, are probably some of the ones that didn't survive or ultimately got gobbled up by the bigger players. For a long while, at least, and certainly through the majority of my career when I was direct day-to-day selling with retailers, the reality was the ones that were winning, the Walmarts, the Costcos, the Dollar Generals, the H-E-Bs, we're not charging a lot of these things, and we're much more focused on the sell and just getting a dead net cost. So I think if we go back 30 years, those that were overly focused on this and had a long list of chargebacks, if you will, probably didn't do as well in the last 30 years. I think what's interesting, though, is right now, if you look at the top retailers, which includes a Walmart, a Costco, a Dollar General, they're all having different levels of fines and fees. Costco probably the less of anyone, but certainly the rest have a lot. So it's even some of the ones that succeeded in the last 30 years by being self-focused are now somewhat buy-focused as well.
Is that because at the end of the day, they perceived there was no advantage to them in not taking the fees, and that they were leaving too much money on the table? I mean, is that essential? I mean, it was, hey, listen, if those 8 companies are going to dip their beak, I need to be able to dip my beak as well. I'm big into Godfather and Soprano references this morning, I recognize.
Yeah, I've not talked to enough of those retailers to understand exactly if that's the philosophy. I'm sure that's an element, but I think the reality is that the retailer has seen, like, for example, since the pandemic, huge increases in cost. in doing business in certain ways, like buy online, pick up in store, and is trying to manage that cost within a P&L that we all know is a tight P&L with low margins. And so as they try to offset those costs, they're looking to their vendor community to be a part of that. I'd also say, some of the costs we're when we Simpactful look at, like I said, up to 12 different buckets of cost that a vendor could see. We're including things like retailer data. We're including, retailer media. And I think many retailers, rightfully so, see those as very beneficial to the brand. So, and so while it may be a required investment that a brand needs to make, it's not as if there's not some benefit to the brand as well.
Sure. I mean, let's go. I want to talk about retail media in a second, within the context of the larger question, but go back to a second to BOPUS, right? I was astounded to find out that manufacturers are being, if you have a store and I come to you and I go into the store, I shop and I check out and go to my car, there's whatever the fees are associated with that. But if I order online and I either pick it up at the curb inside, or I would assume if they deliver to me, a lot of retailers are charging manufacturers for that. They're putting an extra fee on that.
Yes. Yep.
I don't know. Am I wrong? Is that nuts? I mean, is in the sense that, I don't know. I mean, it seems to me as a retailer, I have a responsibility to take on the costs of connecting to my consumer. And and at a certain point, I only do business with the manufacturers. I mean, it's not just that. If I change my shelf set, I'm going to charge them for that. If I change prices, I'm going to charge them for that. These 12 buckets are extraordinary. At some point, I'm making decisions, it seems to me, because of who I can get the most money from, not necessarily who's providing the products that are going to best satisfy my customers.
Yeah, and certainly if the retailer is doing the right thing for their shopper,
right,
they're going to still take a very true category management based approach. They're going to still focus on the brands and the overall category strategy that's going to help them win. But to your point, if that strategy and plan gets overly influenced by who's willing to pay or not pay the different 12 buckets, then that's where the buy focus becomes detrimental to the effort to maximize the sale to the consumer.
Well, and it's got to put smaller manufacturers at a real disadvantage because they don't have the deep pockets that the big manufacturers do, right? So breaking in has got to become even harder.
It certainly can, although I think small manufacturers also sometimes have an advantage. We've seen a massive shift in brands that were first launched direct to consumer and create a loyal following direct to consumer, now expanding into brick and mortar retail, something that our company has helped well over 20 different brands on that brick and mortar expansion just from DTC. And the reason I say there's some advantage there is that they've built a cost structure from the ground up that may be able to better manage or anticipate these costs. A lot of those companies too that we work with have built very good P&Ls by retailer, by route to market. They know their P&L for direct to consumer. They know their P&L down to a very specific cost when they sell through Amazon or when they sell to Walmart or Target. That's something we don't always see from the traditional big manufacturers, is a really good cost accounting by retailer. And one of the things that cost accounting, that P&L allows, is you can just be much smarter about what you will invest in and what you want, because you see the whole picture. So I don't disagree with your general premise. It could create an imbalance of bigger companies and brands with deeper pockets versus smallers, but I wouldn't say it's a complete imbalance given the success many of these smaller brands have had in the direct to consumer model.
What about smaller retailers? Whether you're talking a one-store independent, a three-store independent, or even a regional chain, do they have access to the same? Can they? are they in any position to make the same kind of demands of these manufacturers that the giants are able to make?
Well, I think I think if they're savvy and if they stand their ground,
Right.
they have a chance. But clearly, this is a classic big example of scale coming into play for the bigger retailers, leverage. And when smaller players don't have that, I'm guessing there's no doubt they're not taking advantage of some of these. A lot of this isn't initially negotiated. It isn't agreed to, and then as you said, a check is cut. It's deducted off an invoice, and then the onus goes immediately back to the brand to reconcile that and either accept it or go back to the retailer and dispute it and then negotiate on it. And my point being tied to your message on smaller retailers, they equally have the ability to deduct. Many are also being supplied through large wholesalers who do have some scale. So to get these, so it's anyway, it certainly is a challenge for smaller retailers.
Are there manufacturers out there, because we're dealing with deductions as opposed to checks being written, that don't even, I'm oversimplifying it, but at some level don't even know what they're paying? I got to imagine that
I think that's very likely.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And I don't know how much this would exist today. I happen to know, and call it over the last 30 years, maybe dated back with some of those retailers we were talking, wholesalers that don't exist anymore, that some of them used to keep a list of what level of deduction a manufacturer would accept with no dispute. This manufacturer, if we deduct $999 because their deduction limit is $1,000, they won't dispute it off every invoice. On this manufacturer, it's $499 because the bell goes off when it's 500 and above. I don't know if people do that today. I do know that was a practice in the past. These amounts we're talking about aren't $1,000 and below. They're much higher. And I'm not suggesting anybody's doing that, but I think it does tie to a theme. When you have a massive number of invoices between, every day between you and retailers, and there's a mismatch and there's massive number of deductions, the reconciliation of that is challenging. And let's again go back to the time and effort to reconcile that adds cost to the system, which could lead to costs to the consumer at the end of the day.
It's so, for lack of a better word, it all just seems so deeply, deeply cynical.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting. I mean, to go back to the retail media network thing, I mean, that suggests to me, it's part of the bigger problem, I suppose. Everybody's looking for alternative sources of funding, right? And I've been writing my morning newsbeat for years. Nobody knows what anything really costs, and this is all part of the problem, right? Nobody knows what that thing is supposed to cost because there's so many fees, allowances, right? The whole thing is that I think consumers would be shocked if they knew this stuff was going on, which sort of leads me to my next question, which is, could this be an issue for the FTC going forward? Especially, okay, they've got a big merger to deal with, right? They got Kroger, Albertsons. I have no idea what fees and allowances and deductions Kroger's doing. And I don't exactly know what Albertsons is doing, but let's assume that they're not exactly the same. They're suddenly going to be in a much better position beyond everything else to charge more, to have more fees, to have them encompass 5,000 plus stores as opposed to 2,000 and 3,000 plus stores. And I would think that at some level, this is the kind of thing that at least conceivably could be brought up during an FTC hearing to say, are you, because that's money that smaller retailers are not going to get. They're going to be able to demand more. The whole notion of being power buyers. I mean, it just seems to me that this is and I probably could have picked 1,000 places in the past 30 years where it could have blown up. But it seems to me there's at least the potential for this to kind of blow up and become an issue, maybe to a degree that it has not before.
Yeah, you're truly outside my
Okay.
expertise level. I try to stay away from FTC.
Oh, I'm
Uh,
out.
no, I know,
Here's the
I
good thing
know.
about being a pundit.
Yeah,
I have no specific expertise. I just got
yeah.
opinions.
Well, I think it would come down to, and I think this is something that ties back to kind of what can brands be doing. As I think about your question, I think the question would be which of these required investments are truly beneficial, truly improve, the opportunity for the shopper. Retail media comes into play, for example. Some retailers I'm sure would argue that their on time and full OTIF program is designed to ensure that product is available every day on time when the consumer wants it and needs it. And so I think there is an argument they would make. I'm just trying to put myself in their shoes, that there is a consumer benefit and a brand benefit to these costs. But there is no doubt it's incumbent on a brand to identify which of these costs are beneficial to the business and the ROI and to delivering consumer value, and which are not. And those that aren't are where they need to start to figure out how they can bring them under control.
So does the industry need sort of an ECR2, for lack of a better phrase, in terms of does the industry need to, if it's a little out of control, and it sounds to me like it is, although granted, not everybody would agree with that assessment, but would the industry and consumers be well served by a kind of ECR2 initiative that sought to at least establish some ground rules, figure out what maybe actually do a deep dive into what you were just saying. What are the ones that are good for the business and good for the consumers, and which are the ones that is just protection money? Now that's not how, it's probably not fair, but that's but right, to figure out which ones are which ones are good, which ones are sense. Would the industry be well served by that?
Well, first of all, let me say I have to be willing to guess I know one of your favorite movies of all time. Godfather must be very high on the list. Yeah, it's because the protection money was another element there. But and I love the movie as well. So,
right.
But could the industry benefit? The short answer is I think consumers can benefit if the two entities can do everything possible to keep cost as low as possible. I think both entities, shareholders will benefit if costs are as low as possible. The thing that runs through my mind as you say, ECR2 is the industry is so dramatically different than when ECR1 came around. There was an industry, there was not as much business being done by a handful of retailers. For us to think through, would Walmart want to partner in an initiative with Kroger, with Dollar General to work this together, when part of the reason they've worked so hard to get big and massive is so they can have negotiation power and have their own unique strategy. So it could be beneficial. My mind jumps to, is it even possible in today's day and age?
That's a really good point. And you just used a line though to talk about, that when you talk about costs, the industry, everybody talks about driving costs out of the system. But the thing about the system that we're talking about here is costs aren't being driven out of the system here.
No,
certainly not for everybody. I mean, retailers are, and so, it does strike me as, it seems to me to be deeply flawed. Now, I don't know if it's a construct that's like one of those bridges that lasts for 100 years and then collapses, or if it's a house of cards where you get a good stiff win from the FTC and then it collapses. I'm not sure. It's been around for a long time, so it's probably closer to the former than the latter. But it does strike me as being sort of this, again, a deeply flawed, corrupt, with a small c, system that at the end of the day probably is not serving consumers very well.
Well, again, I go back to, we go all the way from where, a product starts, the field, through into the consumer's cart, into their home. There's a lot of cost.
Right.
And, there's books that have been written about, Sam Walton talked to manufacturers about, this should be a simple business. You make it, you sell it to me, I pay you, we're done. I'm not sure we ever had anything close to that simple of a system in the past, but reality is it's more complex today than ever, particularly given now all the power sits with the consumer. We truly have entered the omni-channel that we've all been talking about, where she and he can get products anywhere, anytime, anyhow. And that requires retailers and brands to make their products available anywhere, anytime, anyhow. And there's a cost to that. So I think there's a question of where does that cost sit? Is it on the retailer's P&L? Is it on the brands? Or what can the, and who pays for it? And that's what needs to be addressed. I mean, what we at Simpactful are trying to do in a lot of our work with the manufacturers is how can we collaborate? How can you collaborate with the retailer to bring a focus back to reducing these costs? I think if we go back to ECR, the benefit is how can back then, how can efficient assortment, efficient replenishment, efficient promotion drive down, how can we do all that and drive down costs? That's where today I think it needs to be an individual manufacturer working with an individual retailer on how can they reduce that cost end to end, and then jointly agree, hopefully, to pass that value in part to the consumer and obviously in part to their bottom line. We're not seeing as much of that collaboration as certainly we saw back in the days of ECR broadly across the industry.
And as you said before, maybe it's not possible, but one would like to think it is.
Yeah.
Listen, I could talk about this for like hours. This is just so interesting.
Me as well. It's fascinating.
But I appreciate your time. And I will put both your email address and Simpactful's website address below, so people can reach out to you if they want. But David Friedler, I really appreciate your time. I think I understand it a little bit better now, and maybe we'll talk about it again down the road.
Kevin, that would be great. I appreciate your time, and thank you for bringing me on.
My pleasure.